Hello, I'm Neve Flanagan, and this is a wrap-up and review of SP217, the BSOC Child and Family Policy module in Maynooth University. The module has been structured around 6 units representing key aspects of child policy. We began with the history and development of Irish child policy, which showed us how policy evolved from Brehon times up to today's policies. This brought us to the unit on contemporary policies. At international level, we looked at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and this underpins much of our domestic legislation, such as Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, which is our national policy framework for children and young people. Our next unit looked at children in need, focusing particularly on child poverty and child protection. And having followed the evolution of child services in the history unit, under substitute care, we consider the current state of policy and practice with regard to fostering, residential care and adoption. Returning to children who remained in their homes, we looked at 2 sets of family circumstances which impact on children. We looked at lone parent-headed households, and we looked at child witnesses of domestic violence. Our next unit looked at the growing migrant population in Ireland, considering such groups as child refugees, child asylum seekers, unaccompanied minors, and child victims of human trafficking. Finally, the last unit briefly considered the evidence which supports child policy decision-making in Ireland. The history and evolution of child policy has much to teach us about the practices or policies which should not have been repeated. However, there are also many positive lessons from which we can learn. For example, our starting point, the Brehon laws in medieval Ireland, offer examples of equality, justice, and responsibility in the way children are treated by a society. While these laws have not been enforced since the 17th century, they have been invoked repeatedly throughout our history as models to aspire to. In the 16 and 1700s, we find early fragments of social policy, fragments which are characterized by an emphasis on institutionalization, such as a response to the problem of society. Beginning with the houses of correction in the 1600s, these were followed in the 1700s by the houses of industry, and out of the houses of industry workhouses emerged the foundling hospitals for children. These were establishments whose infamy set a sad precedent for institutional childcare. The next chapter in child policy in the early 19th century sees the introduction of a poor law to Ireland. This chapter continues the infamy of institutional care, with workhouses operating under the explicit standard that life in the workhouse should be worse than the standard of living of the lowest labourer outside. For children, there was little care, and they could be said to have become lost in the crowd in this era of extreme poverty, famine, and emigration. Notwithstanding the horrors of the poor law workhouse provision, the poor law was the foundation of our social policy system, which began with recognition of the additional needs of such groups as the sick, disabled, old, and children. This recognition ultimately gave rise to early disability policies. It kick-started early health policies and policies for older people. Likewise, the poor law system prompted developments in foster care and in industrial schools, and these were followed by advances in prevention of child cruelty, childcare, juvenile justice, child welfare, and ultimately child protection. As we move towards the 20th century, social researchers and social reformers, such as Booth and Rowntree, brought children out of the shadows through their research, putting the spotlight on children as individuals rather than mini-adults or the property of their parents. These social reformers provided the vital evidence to support a more liberal agenda in child policy in the early years of the 20th century. Following rapidly on the heels of the new Liberal agenda, the Irish Free State gained its independence from Britain. As a young nation, struggling to find its feet economically and striving to express its unique national identity, children slipped down the priority list, and there were few child policy advances in the first half of the century. The very conservative and very Catholic ideology of the new Irish Free State was a hindrance rather than a help to child policy. From the second half of the 20th century, we begin to see the emergence of what we know now as the contemporary child policy landscape. Financial support in the form of a universal child benefit was put in place. Child welfare and child protection services evolved from a voluntary to a statutory basis. Substitute care, such as foster care, residential care, expanded from their historical forms, and adoption was formalised and put on a legal footing. Throughout this century, however, the dark shadow of the industrial schools issue continued, only ending in the 1970s, to be followed by the more recent revelations about the horrors of this brand of institutional care for children. Throughout the 20th century, statutory responsibility for children has evolved from disjointed care to a current situation of a dedicated state agency for children, that's TUSLA, and a full cabinet minister with responsibility for children and young people. From the 1980s, the rights of children were enshrined in international law under the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and statutory expression was increasingly given to the recognition of the best interests of the child, recognition that this should be paramount over and above the rights or the wishes of parents or other adults. In the 1990s, Irish society was rocked by a series of high-profile child abuse scandals, prompting development of child protection guidelines. First introduced in 1999, Children First guidelines are now on a statutory footing. One area of child policy which we only addressed briefly was the area of juvenile justice. The history of child policy brought us to the second unit of the module, which addressed contemporary policies. Firstly, at international level, we looked at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which underpins our domestic child policy legislation. At national level, Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures is our national policy framework for children and young people. This overarching policy is supported by a series of strategies on research, child participation, youth, LGBT youth, family support, juvenile justice, well-being, and the most recent addition, the Early Years Strategy. Of course, these strategy documents outline what the state should be doing to honour the rights of children, but we must look to other sources such as midterm reviews or the Children's Rights Alliance report card to see if the government is actually keeping its promises to children. Our review of the Children's Rights Alliance report card acted as a bridge between the policies that we focused on to date and the actual impact of service provision on children in Ireland. Moving on to focus on groups of children in need within Irish society, we firstly looked at children in poverty. CSO statistics indicate that as many as 1 in 9 children in Ireland are living in consistent poverty, and indeed, children are at much greater risk of poverty than adults. A second group of children in need are those who come to the attention of child protection services, children who have been neglected or abused or are at risk of being abused. Throughout our consideration of history, we've seen how child protection services have evolved, and in particular, over the past 2 decades, Children First guidelines and legislation have framed how the statutory agencies, such as TUSLA and An Garda Síochána, manage the child protective services in Ireland. These guidelines also outline the roles and responsibilities of the general public and mandated persons vis-à-vis child protection. For children who come into the care of the state, a substitute for parental care is required. In our unit on substitute care, we considered foster care and kinship or relative care, which have been recognised types of substitute care since medieval times and account for the vast majority of out-of-home care in Ireland, approximately 92%. We considered residential care and briefly touched on aftercare and special care. We also looked at adoption, both domestic and foreign adoption, which is a more permanent type of care. For each of these types of substitute care, we considered the nature of the care arrangement, numbers and trends over time, statutory responsibilities, practices and procedures, and national standards where they were available. For the next unit, we returned to children who remain with their families but require statutory support. We looked at how the circumstances of the family can have a significant effect on children's lives. Firstly, we focused on one-parent families. The number of households headed by a lone parent has grown rapidly, and in 2016, as many as 1 in 5 children in Ireland were living in families which were headed by a lone parent. One of the key issues for children in these family types is the notably higher risk of poverty, with one-parent families being 5 times more likely to live in consistent poverty than two-parent families. We also considered child witnesses of domestic violence. TUSLA data indicated that services funded by the Child and Family Agency provided support to over 5,000 children and young people affected by domestic violence in 2015. Indeed, over half of these children had been forced to leave their homes as a result of domestic violence and were accommodated in emergency accommodation, such as refuges or safe houses. The impacts on the lives of children who witness domestic violence are wide-ranging and significant. The global migrant crisis has been to the fore of social and political discourse in recent years, and we can return to the Children's Rights Alliance report card to see how Ireland is stepping up to honour the rights of these children arriving in Ireland. Regrettably, successive report cards have suggested that Ireland is failing these children. The term child migrants is used in statistical contexts as an umbrella term for children who are not of Irish nationality or who are born to migrant parents. This includes both families who have left their country of origin and still enjoy its protection, and families who have fled persecution and no longer enjoy the protection of their home nation. This latter group includes child refugees, asylum seekers, unaccompanied minors, and child victims of human trafficking. These different groups, while having some similarities, have different rights, different experiences, different supports, and indeed very different levels of visibility in Ireland. Throughout the module, we've drawn on a substantial evidence base. We've looked at trends, such as the number of child asylum seekers. We've looked at proportions, such as the proportion of children who are at risk of poverty. Profiles such as the nature of abuse among referrals to TUSLA. And we've also drawn on descriptive findings about what life is like for different cohorts of children in Ireland. The final unit of our module looked briefly at this evidence base, which plays such an important role in making sure that child policy decisions are informed and evidence-based. This module set out with the aim of exploring child policy in Ireland to promote understanding of where it has come from, where it's at now, and what impact it is having on children. So many of the areas we've touched on warrant further study, and I hope this module will encourage you to continue your study of child policy. In the meantime, thank you for your active participation.